I don't know if TechTube allows QuickTime format, so we'll find out. And can everybody on the phone hear me?
From QuickTime, you can export as another format.
Can you? So Rappel, it stands for Rapid Prototype Library. If you ask me what it was, it's an HTML component library that assists with common prototyping features and patterns. And it's really meant to assist you build your prototype. You're not really going to build a prototype from it. Like any new features that you're going to try to build, you may still have to come up with code for those. So this is for common things like buttons, dialogues, tabs. But that's not to say that you couldn't potentially build a new way of accessing information using this framework. There's other similar UI libraries, YUI, jQuery UI, which is different from jQuery JavaScript library, which Rappel is built off of, and then Twitter Bootstrap. These are all things that allow you to easily incorporate UI components into your prototypes. So you may ask why do we need Rappel? For one, we own it. We can add things to it, customize it, skin it, test new features. Working with static data, most UI libraries assume that you have server-side technologies to deliver that data to you. And with this, it allows you to kind of mimic that functionality with JavaScript data. And then it's built with the idea that you don't need to know JavaScript in order to have these complex or cool features in your prototype. And so I just want to cover some really basic fundamentals and how they relate to Rappel. This is an HTML tag. Everybody knows that. This is called an attribute. You can have multiple attributes on a link. Some attributes are specific to specific HTML tags, like the href is specific to a link tag. Hey. And so how this relates to Rappel is that to add functionality to any of these HTML tags, you supply a specific class to the class attribute of a tag. So normally a link tag would open that settings.html file in the browser. It would reload the window. So if you add this class to it, RPL_dialog link, it will open that file inside of a HTML dialog. So that's all you would need to do in order to utilize the dialog in Rappel. But that same idea can be applied to any number of components. So that's just one example. And the other kind of fundamental idea about Rappel that you have to understand in order to use it is it makes use of a new HTML5 feature called the data attribute. This allows developers to supply any type of attribute on any type of HTML tag. So for example, href, you can't put that on a span tag. So if there was an attribute I needed for that specific tag, for a span tag, I can prefix it with data dash and call it whatever. One example for the Rappel library is data dash selector. It's one that's often used to target a specific component that you want to take action on, and it always takes a CSS selector. So if you know in CSS how to select a child h1 tag of all P's or anything like that, you can use this attribute. And as an example, here's a link that toggles a specific element, the visibility of an element. You can tell it toggles it because there's RPL_toggle. And then I supply data-selector and pass it the selector to the element I want to take action on. So that same idea is replicated throughout all components in Rappel, most of them. And if anybody has any questions as I go along, feel free to interrupt. And just a closer look at that data attribute again. The data dash is HTML5 portion, so I have no control over what that's called. Rappel library doesn't control that. Anything after that is specific to Rappel. There's other data attributes that Rappel uses, but right now it's not really important to know that or memorize these. They're all documented in the Rappel documentation website at proto/Rappel. The important thing to kind of take away from this is that Rappel utilizes these attributes for specific tasks. And so I'm going to do kind of a deep dive into the library, show you some components and how to set it up. Does anybody have any questions on what I've covered so far?
So what browsers are supported?
So that's a good question, actually. Pretty much anything but IE, of course. I don't test per se in other browsers. If there was more people contributing and stuff, we could maybe test and have a broader browser base. But right now, it's mainly Safari, Firefox, and Chrome. Yeah. So if you're testing a prototype using Rappel, those are the browsers you'd want to stick to. And while we're on that topic, there are peculiar issues with WebKit browsers, which are Chrome and Safari. They have a security feature which prevents you from accessing local files on your computer from the web browser. So if you're using a Rappel feature where you pass a path to a file, for example, dialogues, a dialogue will load an HTML file that you tell it to load. That won't work locally unless you have, this word sounds scary, a web server running on your local machine. It's really not scary. There's really easy ways to set it up. But the most easy way to overcome that is to work in Firefox locally, and then just know that it's going to work when you push it up to Proto, regardless. Any questions about that? Because that's probably the most confusing portion of Rappel. Okay. So first I'm going to do a real quick setup on like a new file, HTML file, and show you how you can build from scratch, and then I'll explore creating an app using the starter app. So if I want to create one from scratch, I just copy these 3 links and use whatever application you use. I happen to use Dreamweaver just because I have since school. So this is my app. Call it index. And you'll see the instructions say to paste it just before your closing head tag. So this may look familiar to a lot of people. I don't know what everybody's skill levels are. But this is the Aloha style sheet from Rappel. You can either use this or you can use rappel.css. Aloha provides all of the Aloha styles. I hope to do a Nest one soon. jQuery, if you have a jQuery file already included, you don't need this. This is just the Rappel copy of jQuery. And then the root Rappel JavaScript file. So let's see here. This is my app. So there's really nothing you can do right now. I mean, you can do stuff, but it's not apparent here. We'll go ahead and just throw something in there and make sure it's working. Let's do buttons. Buttons are a pretty commonly used component. So that's a button with a menu. And so I just came into the documentation site, and I'm going to copy the example HTML just so I have a really quick basis to start from. And I'll put it right in here. So I'll just cover this component really quick before I go into other components. This is the action style. This is a unique style to Rappel that actually initializes these so that it looks like an Aloha button. So if I remove that, it's easier for you to override the styles to some specific style that you want. This is the button. This will all make sense once you see it live. My button. And then this is the menu that appears when you click the button. You can put anything inside of here. So I could put just text if I wanted. So I'll go back to my application, and there's my button. And it says test. Of course, it resizes to the size of the text, so if there was longer links in there, it would resize, or you could style it, just make it wider. So just a real quick example of how you could override Rappel styles. You see there's this ugly gradient on here. Let's just make a CSS folder. This is a convention that I follow. I make a folder for CSS, a folder for JavaScript, and so on. So this is my root.css file. You guys can name it whatever you want. And whatever file you use to override the Rappel styles you would put below the Rappel style sheet. And so this should be kind of, if you're a coder or if you do HTML, you should kind of maybe know this. But if not, that's how you override styles. So I'll open up the root style sheet. So there we've override one Rappel style, and I may want to, let's just add a container here. This is just, this isn't anything to do with Rappel, but just so you guys can see it a little better. What's that?
Typo on margin.
Oh, okay. Mirroring.
Yeah, so that was.
Let's just wrap this in a div with ID. Alright, so it's a little prettier, not stunning, but it'll do. Let's throw tabs in there. Tabs are a pretty common feature. That's everything you see here. This documentation site was built with Rappel. So we'll go down to tabs, and again I usually just copy the example code and I'll paste it directly in here. Okay, and so these are the tabs that you actually click on, and these are the tab views. So you'll see that there's a direct correlation and mapping between a tab view and the actual tab. So tab 1 controls this tab view, tab 2 controls this tab view.
Just based on order?
Yep. Yeah, and while we're looking at tabs, if there was ever any HTML between these two components, it wouldn't know which tab container to target. So if you put something in between these two, this needs an ID. And then this needs that data-selector attribute that I spoke to earlier, pointing to my tab view, so that it knows which one to target. And another way of doing this is you don't need to supply the views. You could store all your views in files and just pass files here. So I would create a folder called tabs, tab1.html, and do the same thing here, and then it would automatically populate this tab view with those files. It's a little bit cleaner if you have a really complex application. But for this example, we'll just do this. I'll throw this HTML that I already included here. And thank you. We'll call this whatever, settings. So I'm going to call the first tab home, and the second tab settings. Let's give it a refresh, and there's tabs. And if you don't want those styles, again, and this makes it a little easier to override styles. And so everything works in there, and I think I'll show you sorting and filtering, which is one cool feature. I just kind of want to show you an assortment and miscellaneous components from Rappel so you get an idea of how to work with it. So it may not make sense in this example we show, but it gives you the know-how to actually do it yourself. So I'm going to just really quickly hand code. I should have probably done this beforehand, but let's pretend like this is a feed of elements. call it the feed. And we'll have a user.
For what?
Frank Smith, let's say he sold something. He sold $2,000. So I'm giving all of these classes so that we can target which specific data value from each row that we want to filter on. And we'll just put a fake date in here. It's a long time ago. We'll copy this and we'll just do 3 of them for now. Call this guy Rappel. And we'll change some of these quantities. This guy's probably, whatever, $200. And different dates here. Whatever. Okay, so that alone, it's just HTML. But we'll come in here and we will look at sorting. And you'll see the example here. I can sort by name, amount, sold, newest first, oldest first, etc. I'm going to copy just this portion, which are the publisher links. And we'll paste it directly in here. And so what we have here is the actionable class sorter with the style initiator and data selector. So that points to what you want to sort. So we want to sort the feed. And again, this is a CSS selector. So you need the pound sign in front of there because it points to an ID of an element.
Should be the sort or the feed.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, the feed. And okay, so all of the links inside of the RPL sort will take action on the feed. And again, here's the ubiquitous data selector. This points to the specific data item that you want to sort on. So you remember I added these class, name, price, date. We'll want name to sort by name, amount, we'll just do price. Newest first, we'll do date. And oldest first date. So now we're getting into 2 new classes. Again, this is all documented in the components of Rappel, but this is a way to force a sort link to do descending and ascending. Since we named them newest first and oldest first, we put those classes on there. And we did RPL selected on this element because that's the one we want to be sorted by on load. So let's go ahead and refresh. And you'll see it's sorted by newest first. You could do oldest, go by name, and amount, 200, 2000. So that's an easy way to sort. And is there any questions about what I've shown so far?
Could you, go back to the code?
Yeah.
So does RPL sorter have to be on a div, or can it be on, say, a list, like an unordered list object?
Yep, it could be on anything.
Could be on it.
Yep. For example, oh, go ahead.
And then, so then you could have like styling tags around the anchor tags, or do they?
Yep. Yeah, you can. One.
I was just thinking of putting it in the button there. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's a good use case. So you would just throw it in here, and you would make this a UL with LIs or whatever you wanted it to be, and then, of course, I have that styling on there, so let's remove that. That's one reason you wouldn't want the styling on there. And so now you can sort using the button. And that goes for any of the components in Rappel. You could put the filters in a button, or you can just put them standalone. There's a component called setAttributeLink, which it's pretty powerful. It allows you to target any element on the page and change any attribute on that element. You could put those in buttons. You could probably put tabs in there if you wanted. And so one similar feature to sorting is filters. It's the same HTML that you just seen. You'll see it filters elements. So I just copied it. We'll leave the sorter in the button, and for this you just want the same syntax. It points to the feed. And so the way that the filter works is it's by CSS class. So we'll call this one a sale, we'll call this one a sale, and maybe this one's an opportunity. Alright, and so then again, data selector, opportunity, sale, sales. So let's see. So I just want to see sales, and I just want to see opportunities, or I want to see all. And then again, you can sort from there. And so that kind of shows like how you can combine different Rappel components and features. Now, this looks like crap, obviously. If you're going to build an application from scratch and not use Aloha or Nest or whatever styles we end up coming up with, this is the way to go. But if you know you're going to be designing for Aloha, we have a starter application which has a bunch of components already in here. It has buttons, data loops, which I may get to by the end of this. And one cool thing it has, which is geared towards testing, it allows your researcher or you, whoever sets up the test, to kind of personalize it to the person doing the testing. So if the user is me, for example, the researcher, you could go to my Facebook page or my Gus page, wherever you want to go. Let's just grab this image. And then update back to the app, and you'll see it's personalized to me. So it says Ben Snyder. It's got my image. So then if I was to use a Rappel publisher component, which I may not have time to get to, and published a feed item to this data loop, it would use my name and my image. And these are stored in cookies, so if you have a fresh session, if you're about to test somebody else, you need to either quit the browser or clear your cookies.
So to get that user in there, can it be an image, or does it have to be a link to some person?
It could be an image. So if you have an image in your images directory, for example, you would just have to then point this input to
Okay, and then you could be using it.
images/myimage.ping. Yep. And these utilize the feature called Rappel cookies. It's a semi-accurate name for this, for what it uses. So you could declare more of these if there was a user email. I might as well I'll download the starter app here and show you how that's hooked in. So, show and finder. Alright, so I'm going to just put it in that same directory. Remember, I have my app, so I'll just put it alongside there. Let's open it up. Move that to trash. And so here it is. It's in there. I'll close out the stuff that I just built here. And navigate to it. And so this is my local copy of that app that I just downloaded. So just to cover the setup, since I just went over that, you know what? Well, okay, so this may look a little confusing to people just because there's so many files here. But it's the same files that I copied for my starter app. You'll see my Aloha styles, the jQuery file, which you don't need if you have your own jQuery file, then the Rappel JavaScript file. And then there's this extra style sheet, which is just an empty style sheet for you to start overriding Rappel styles with. And then there's an empty JavaScript file for you to start doing any custom JavaScript that you may have, which isn't necessary. And there's a data.js file, which is one of the more advanced features of Rappel. And it does, so the idea is that designers who can do JavaScript would build these data files for people, and then you can swap out data files depending on which prototype you're working on and what kind of data you need, whether it's contacts, cases, or mixed. But it's here for you. There's a sample of what a data file looks like here. And so data.js, that's not to be confused with the data dash attribute. Data here is referring to the actual user data or whatever data you're storing in JavaScript. I couldn't think of a better name for it, and so there is that little confusion between the data dash attribute and the data.js file. A more Yep. Yeah, this is what's populating that feed. I didn't want to get into it, but since you asked, I'll show it. It's useful to see how that works. I just opened this file. See, it's in tabs, tab1.html. And this is what populates that feed. Okay. It's this is RPL_feeds. That's just for style. You can remove that. This is the functional class, RPL data loop. And then here's another data attribute from Rappel. It's data-js. It's called JS because that signifies that you have to pass a JavaScript object to it. Now, front end, that's as complicated as it gets to implement data loops. So if you can have somebody give you a data file that they already built, like Megan Hoagland is building one now for Chatter, if she passes that to you, then you just need to know what to put in this attribute. And then what you see here, this is what's called an item renderer. It's kind of an industry term for what this does. It's a chunk of HTML that will get replicated for each data item there is in that data-js. So you'll see users. This is 1 user, 2 user, 3 user. This gets repeated until there's no more data items to loop through. And you'll see these funky, this is a syntax to include values in your item renderers. Okay, so fname, lname, fname, lname. And so when Rappel loops through all of the data, it replaces these weird looking things with those values. And so you're left with this data, this loop of elements. So why is that necessary, and why would I ever want to use that? Well, if you're working on a feed prototype, for example, if you have 100 feeds or you want to test some really complex use case where there's a lot of items, you don't want to have to hand code all of those items, and then if you have one small design change, you have to go into each one and make that change. Whereas in this example, you have one chunk of HTML. If I wanted this image to be after the H3, I change it once, and then it won't do anything here. But I guess a better example would be if I wanted the date after the comment. I do it once, and it takes effect in all of the feed items. And you can do, that's using divs and spans. You can do data loops with tables. And then you could apply, you can make this a sorter so that the columns actually sort. And okay, so any questions on that feature? That's probably one of the more advanced ones. That and states.
Is it possible to pull that item template out into a separate file? And
yes, good question. Yeah.
Feeds on every single page in the entire system.
Yeah. So this takes another attribute called data renderer. Data renderer. Yeah, that's right. And so you may have a folder called, I'll just do rend, and you could have feed item.html, and then you would just copy this chunk and put it inside of this feed item. One thing that I don't have built out yet is a way to utilize different feed items depending on the data. So like if you had in here, this is actually a sale, and this is an opportunity, and you want them to use different item renderers. Right now there's no way to pick a specific item renderer for a specific data item, but what you would do is, so I'm passing this class into each data item, and that class gets applied to that specific item. So you would just include all of your HTML in the item renderer, and then use CSS to show the specific parts for whatever item that happens to be. Yeah. And then by default, whatever your default feed item is, you would hide the ones that, you know, like sales information or a link or a video, whatever it happens to be.
So you could do like, so let's say you had that sale and opportunity in your item renderer, you could just have an overall div and then 2 divs inside sale and opportunity.
Yep.
And then
Exactly.
just turn one on or off depending on the overarching type.
Yeah, that's the idea. Yeah, that's the workaround. If that's suitable for a lot of people, it may not be useful to be able to declare different item renderers. It might be nicer to have them all in one file. So yeah, that's the way you would do it now. And okay, and then so that kind of covers data loops. There's a lot to explore there. If you have time, just go to the Rappel docs site. Going back to the setup here, how did I do John Smith and change it to Ben and put my image in there? There's a thing called RPL set cookie, and this is a way for you to set browser cookies using HTML. So I set the default as John Doe and using this blank man image. And so to reference this value, you use a RPL get cookie. So do you see the difference? There's one that's called set, which sets it, and then there's one called get that gets it. And the get cookie, of course, needs to know which cookie to get. So again, here's data selector, username. So that's the ID of the set cookie. So anywhere this is in your code, it's going to grab John Doe. So you see I have it here, and I have it here, and then I could also have it in these feed items. It would grab whatever value you set that to. And so the setup portion of that, that's this page. So in the Rappel app, example app, it's in a folder called setup. It's in index.html. This is the HTML to set a cookie, update a cookie. Okay, so this is the most important part of all this HTML that you see here. First off, it's getting the cookie, which is what I just showed you. So it's going to store the value in the input so that you see here it populated that input with John Smith. That's just for ease of knowing which one's currently set. You could easily remove that. But what's more important here is this is an RPL update cookie element. So it updates the value of this cookie. Okay, so when I hit this button called RPL update cookies, Rappel is going to look through here and say, oh, update cookie, which cookie is it updating? And then it takes the value that the user wrote in this input, finds this cookie, updates it, then updates all the references to that cookie.
So if it doesn't exist, it'll fail?
Yeah. You should, that's actually a really good question, because you should declare any cookie that you want to use in the app up top here somewhere before you actually use it.
Okay.
Or else it'll just be blank, or I don't even know what the update cookie would do. It probably just wouldn't do anything. Yep. Yeah, declare it inside the body tag. And set cookies are always invisible. They're always hidden. So you never want to style a set cookie You would style a get cookie, right? Because it could be a header tag, it could be a span tag. Set cookies, again, always visible unless, well, no, yeah. So set cookie always invisible. Update cookies, you could style if you wanted the user to update those cookies themselves. This is kind of more of like a back-end system for you or your researcher to update values in the prototype. But you could still use this same pattern for the user to update these things inside of the application. So if I had a settings tab, I could use those update cookies inputs for the user to change their user credentials or their username, email, whatever it happened to be. All right. And I think actually this is probably a good point to kind of go to the Rappel docs and kind of just go one by one and review the Rappel components. Unless there's anything specific you want to see me integrate into that Rappel app, or you have any specific questions?
How would you, so I mean the back button, what sort of level of control do you have over the behavior of the back button within the prototype? So what things are handled in line with JavaScript versus taking you to a new page that would build up the back button history?
Okay, yeah. So most of Rappel you're going to want to build in an AJAX manner, which means this isn't the most recent. Which means you don't really want page refreshes. So if you're going to bring somebody to a settings page, use tabs or use a loading component. Use something in Rappel that changes the view that they're currently viewing. Mm-hmm. The reason being is that Rappel was originally built as like a one-time, like just a linear prototyping tool, so it didn't retain any of the state. So which means if the page was to refresh, you would lose some of the changes the user did. And it's still like that in a lot of ways. It's getting to a point where you can do page refreshes, but the best thing to do is just kind of build an AJAX application, which will make more sense as you explore how Rappel functions. For example, in a traditional app, as I click these links, the whole page may refresh. But since this is a Rappel application, these are Rappel components that load a new view into this container. And again, another traditional application, this may refresh the entire page, but instead these are Rappel tabs.
So here, clicking back wouldn't bring you back to the component.
Actually, it should. I think that's a. So if you look at, this is another kind of more advanced feature of Rappel. It's states. You can declare states of your application, and it tracks that in the URL. So you see it. I was in components, and then I went to CSS. I think maybe I have to, Rappel has to like refresh the page. I'm not sure, so I'll look into that. But ideally, that's how it would work. You could navigate between states using forward and back.
Some sort of trigger that would build out that back history.
Yeah. While we're on that topic, I can just show you a quick example of states. Where are they? Oh, good eye. So, may not be what you immediately thought, but you actually have to declare states of your application in a states.xml file. That may sound kind of crazy, but here's a really simple example. This is an XML file, which a lot of people may not be used to seeing, but it's pretty much, for all intents and purposes, the same as HTML. There's tags with ID attribute or with attributes, and most of these map directly to their counterparts components within Rappel. So this is a welcome state, and you can pass a series of commands in a state that all get executed when you switch to that state. So this welcome state will execute a tab. It will execute the tab welcome, which is this one. So it'll select that tab, and it will scroll to the top. It'll set that tab's text color to red. Don't worry if you're not getting all of this, because this is a really complex feature. And then it'll add a message to this element, doc row, and the content in that message is blah 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 whatever, and there's a few other I'm passing a class to that message, and then a duration before that message goes away. So what does that do? See the message that it populated in here? So if you give that a second, it'll go away, or I could have clicked OK and it changed the welcome tab to red. Why is this important, and how does it relate to Rappel? This allows you to not have to know JavaScript in order to do things that JavaScript does. You can execute an entire batch of commands with one click. So normally a Rappel component like a toggle link, you click it and it toggles one thing. But if you use a state link that changes a state, you could toggle a component, you could change the tab, you could add a message, and then even more advanced, you can execute your own custom functions. So there's a tag called function, and then the parameters on that tag, or the attributes of that tag, allow you to call a specific function. So that's just a feature that you kind of have to explore. There could be a whole session on just those, I guess. Any questions about states? No. Yeah, I don't know how much those will get used, but it'd be interesting to see. So I'll just go through some of these so you're acquainted with what Rappel has in its arsenal here. Accordions, right? Everybody knows what these are. And most of Rappel components try to follow the same really simple syntax. There's an actionable class, RPL_accordion, and then each of these gets an RPL_accordion pane. And then you can put whatever content you'd like inside of here. It needs this link for a header. And stop me if this is, I don't know if this is a good way to go through it, but I think it is, because it'll give you good exposure to what's here.
The other thing is, I know you wanted to talk about how to contribute.
Yeah, I do actually.
Before time runs out, maybe you could talk
Good idea, yeah. So actually there's a lot of ways that you could contribute. I put this little message in here to try to get people enticed. But there's a lot of things that need to be done with this. One is just using it and making requests, and if there's bugs, reporting bugs, which is probably the #1 thing you could do. I know not a lot of people have time to kind of experiment like that, but it would really push this library along. The second thing at this point in time would probably be documentation. I know that's kind of not a really hot topic to cover, but I don't do a really good job of documenting all these components. If somebody, a documenter or somebody, had time to kind of go through these with me and come up with maybe even just a quick start guide, some of the stuff that I covered in that presentation, that would be super. And then finally, actually contributing to the library. You can do that in 2 ways, which is the first way I mentioned, actually using the Rappel library and coming up with things that you think would be useful for prototyping, and then submit them like a request to get built into the library. And finally, just coding. I mean, if you're really good at JavaScript and jQuery, or maybe you're not really good, but you think you could contribute and just want to take a look at the code and see what you can do, that would be super too. There's a lot of room for expanding into new components and bug fixes and whatnot. So I think those are the primary ways of contributing. Just feel free to reach out to me, and if you're interested in any of those. And there's it's all on Git, our internal implementation of Git, which isn't up right now. But that's where all the code is if you wanted to ever look at the code. And yeah.
Do you have a group right now of people, or is it just you?
Just me right now, yeah.
You had interest in one.
You have a chatter group for.
Oh, there's a chatter group, yeah. There's a Rappel chatter group. But insofar as interest to contribute, there was interest initially, but I think it was kind of like too much to take in at one time. And that person kind of had other things to take care of, so I don't blame them for shying away.
So, is there a gauge? Are you guys
Yeah, so is anybody interested at this point in time to contribute? Would they have time to actually use this in their prototypes?
I might be able to use it in my prototype
Yeah.
screen sharing.
Okay.
And then if I do, then I don't mind, putting it out there.
Yeah.
But I don't know how great it would be, but.
Yeah. And this might not be, Rappel might not be an answer for everybody for every scenario in your prototype, but if you're just a button, like if you need a button, those buttons with the menus, it's a pretty small JavaScript file, so you can include it. And if at any time you feel like, hey, that prototype might be able to use this feature, you can go back and try to incorporate it. There's a few really basic components like the dialog, for example. If you want to use a dialog in your prototype, it's just a really simple way to do that. So if you didn't at first have time to really dive into Rappel, just throwing it on your prototype for future use or for just small things like buttons, and then maybe down the road you could use it for data loops and whatnot. And so this whole thing was kind of like built on a whim, and it was just like little things that I used in my prototypes, and I started adding to it. So that's one of the reasons it might not be suitable for everybody. So as people get to use it and make requests, that's the real valuable aspect.
Yeah, I think I've been talking with Megan about trying to do a chatter prototype, so just like the
Yeah.
whole chatter tab,
Yeah.
using as much Rappel as we can.
Okay.
Try and
Cool.
get multiple designers on the chatter team working on the same prototype. So
Okay.
like the questions that Lauren was asking about pulling pieces out
Mm-hmm.
so that designers can own. So say one designer owns the recommendations widget.
Yeah.
You can make that its own renderer, and everyone else can just call that renderer wherever they want.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
And to
definitely
try and
possible.
Especially with Chatter, we have a lot of designers working on a single page,
Mm-hmm.
and ways to get them to be sort of using the same components and testing everything at the same time.
Okay. Yeah, that makes total sense.
May have some follow-up questions around that.
Okay. Yeah,
we try and
Megan's
do
been
it.
Pinging me for feature requests and stuff. She's really good at that. And
The feed and publish.
yeah. So, and the publisher is one thing I didn't cover, but there's
They've been working on that.
yeah, there's a publisher here that allows you to really quickly. I think in this example, my name's William. Yeah, posted by William. Yeah, so you can create publishers and point them to. You can point a publisher to a specific item renderer that's not being used for the data loop item renderer, right? So if you have a publisher for links, files, cases, and any type of publisher you could think of, if one of those items isn't being used in the item renderer, then you can point that publisher to that specific item renderer and it will use that one. This is the same, and that will use the same syntax as. Did I cover publishers? What did I cover? Oh, the cookies. It uses the same syntax as cookies, sort of. Oh no, I'm sorry. Data loops. Yeah. So these weird little syntax things. That's how you use a publisher. You'll see data set title. So that means it's setting the value from that input into here. That's a really complex one too. So if you have time, just take a look.
Could you reuse the data list renderer for the publisher renderer?
Data list.
Like,
Yes, if you don't supply an item renderer, if you don't, where is it? Yeah, so this is the publisher. If I don't supply a data renderer here, it'll just reuse whatever the data loop is using.
For like data entry, would you use something similar to that you have for setup, like storing that cookie and then?
What type of data entry? Like
Um,
in a table or something, like you're
Table.
changing?
changing or invalidating.
Really, that depends on if you're going to be doing any page refresh after the user makes a change. Then you could use the cookie stuff that I showed, which is the same as setup. Yeah, if the page isn't going to refresh, then you wouldn't have to do that. All right.
So you mentioned that Megan's been reaching out to you. Are there better ways for us to gain your time for support? I know you're busy. I mean,
Yeah.
do you
Office hours might be a good idea. Right now it's just, email, chat, chatter.
Well, I mean, you also have the chatter group. I would say, like, maybe if people have questions, they can post there, and either you can answer if other people in the group can't answer.
Yeah.
Because people who've already had some experience will be able to.
Yep. And I'll reach out if we need to set up a specific time to meet or whatever.
Is there like stuff that other people could help? Like, sometimes I find like the CSS component of it there's a JavaScript part of it. There's like looking at something and just writing the CSS.
Yeah, CSS. That's something I didn't cover.
Some people are stronger in some areas than others, and some people can just look at a page and like, you know what, I can give you the CSS.
Yeah, exactly. That would be super, super helpful, just as helpful as creating the library itself. Right now, there's only 2 items in the CSS template area, and so one of them is a feed item. It's HTML and CSS for a feed item. So if we had all these ideas for CSS components, they could very easily be populated into here. You don't need to know JavaScript for that.
That's something I look for all the time.
Yeah, right.
How do I just draw this thing out?
And that's super helpful too for time constraints. If you need CSS takes a lot of time to build. So.
I'd be more than happy to help with CSS.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I might use this for prototype I'm going to build in the next
Okay.
So.
Yeah. I mean, it could be a CSS library too, where you don't have to use the JavaScript portions of it. You just use it for its CSS rendering. It's all designed for you already. So, yeah, good point, Mustafa.
With that said, Mustafa, are there specific CSS elements that you look for? I mean, that we can start kind of.
I'm trying to rethink like knowledge and like the mobile, the spacing of buttons in mobile. They're just, I'm always like hunting around trying to find these things. And then, so first I hunt for the visual, and then I go after that hunt for the CSS. And I go online and try to just copy, inspect the code and look at it. So I am bouncing all over the place just to find simple things like the button.
Yeah.
Like a mobile button.
And I guess there might be something to say about like keeping it in sync with production components. And I don't have an answer for this, whether we want it to be an exact like copy of production, like what's in Zen. It'd be awesome if we could share Zen CSS, but it's on Blitz, and Blitz is always down, and there's just restrictions to that. So I don't know what the entire team's opinion is on like if our prototype CSS is slightly off from production. It's not that big of an issue, but it's just something to consider. Yeah. As long as the dev knows, like, okay, this is a Zen promotional button, and they look at the Zen library, they know exactly what component to use.
I think as people use it too, they can update the CS. I mean, I think as long as we have a culture of updating what's there when you use it and you see that something's out of sync.
Yeah, you fix it. If we just reference the same.
One really cool, if somebody wanted to tackle a larger project for Rappel and related to CSS, would be Nest UI, the new visuals.
Okay.
Right now, anything we've ever done has been Aloha. So if somebody just wanted to take this basic template and build out a Nest one, it could be used in place of it.
I think some of that stuff might be already done.
Probably, yeah. So maybe we could reuse that. Yeah, so I think that sums up pretty much everything I wanted to cover. And if anybody has any questions or ideas or anything that we've covered so far, just reach out to me or the group or somebody else who's using Rappel. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, man.
Thanks.